Welcome to our study of Jakob Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom, the Shared Reality. So, as always, please generate the intention of bodhicitta, preparing with bodhicitta, which is the intention to engage with this study with the ultimate objective of being able to address the universal condition of delusion that drives samsara. So that's why we're here, not just for our own enlightenment's sake, but for the enlightenment of all sentient beings. But also in this context, then, understanding what we mean with enlightenment, and actually understanding that we are addressing not just the condition of temporary discomfort or suffering or anguish, but really getting to the bottom of this entirely. So with the appreciation of this for the subject matter and also the understanding of the objective, which extends beyond just our own purpose, then we engage with this as we would engage with any Buddhist practice. And ultimately, this is also really what enables us to have confidence in anything that we do. If we know that our motivation is not tinged by selfish agendas and we have a great objective. Now, we fortunately have what we call lineage. We fortunately have teachers. We have our own teacher. We have the presence of great teachers in this world, and we have lineage down from the awakened one, down from the Buddha. And this then includes very great bodhisattva, Jakob Mipham Rinpoche, the author of this work. So we'll be invoking his awakened presence. Understanding Jakob Mipham Rinpoche's ultimate nature is no different from our own nature, and as such, thinking of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche becomes a catalyst for touching on something that's intrinsic to what we actually are, and the qualities of the innate qualities that are unobscured. So as such, we could say the presence of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche becomes is really seen as a reflection of this purity. So we invoke Jakob Mipham Rinpoche through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara. You open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So we are looking at how we can know properly the nature of phenomena. We would say we suffer and wander in confusion and samsara because we misapprehend, we misunderstand the nature of reality. And that's where the Buddha teaches skillfully to begin with what we are understanding, but also encouraging us to deeply investigate what it is that we are understanding or seeing or perceiving. And we perceive a world around us and we perceive ourselves. We have a solid sense of self, a very real sense of self, and we have a very real sense of a solid world around us. And that's fine. But it's on the basis of this that we then have a mind, a sense of self that likes some things and does not like others. When disaster befalls us, then we suffer tremendously. When disaster befalls others, we might have empathy, but we don't actually feel it. And so the fact that suffering befalls us is something that is very different from when suffering befalls others. And yet from the ultimate perspective, this is just things that happen to us. These are things that happen to others. And yet there's a huge difference, whether it's about us or it's about others. So we're very much held by this centering on ourselves, this grasping onto what we then think of as self. And also the way that we perceive the world around us is very much about thinking of it in terms of solid phenomena, the way that we see them, good things, bad things, and so forth. And yet, if we investigate that label, good, bad, and the relationship to it as feeling pleasure or displeasure, which drives our entire perceptions, all our impulses, everything. If we investigate that, we can see these labels are only validated and understood on the basis of the perceiving subject. So our subject plays an enormous role, pivotal role, a central core role in terms of the relationship to our reality, to ourself and the phenomenal world. And that's where the Buddha, he sees that all comes back to a single place, which actually what the Buddha discovered is in his enlightenment and freed himself from, is this obscured condition, this delusional condition in which we take this luminous quality of what we looked at last time also, this luminous mind, that in no way can actually be attributed solidity as it's continually shifting. There's nothing to it that can be grasped. Nevertheless, we attribute self to this. And we attribute on the basis of that also solidity to the objects of the world around us. And that is the big delusion. And that's where the Buddha understood how there's a big difference between how things appear and how they actually are. And when we operate in the world, we generally try to be discerning and intelligent in terms of not being fooled by appearances. Somebody might lead you to believe that if you have this new object, then you'll be like the smiling people in the advertisement. And that way you go, I'll be wiser than that. Or maybe we're not. Maybe we get fooled. But at least we're aware of this quality that lies in being discerning and not being fooled. And we can also see how sometimes on the basis of being deceived and fooled, people suffer. They get tricked, they get cheated, deceived, and so forth. And so what the Buddha would want us is to no longer be deceived and seeing that we could be free if we're not deceived. Mipham Rinpoche, he says, possibly the spiritual path could entirely be defined in terms of stepping out of self-deception. So that's where where the Buddha kindly can appreciate that we all experience our own particular style of delusion. And this is what the Buddha called relative truth. But also what the Buddha wanted us to show is that it's not real the way we think it is. And in order for us to really dismantle this delusion, need to begin to understand the lack of solidity in this perception of a self, this perception of the phenomenal world, the so-called objective world as it's constructed by the so-called subjective self. And that's where then we have this project of essentially wisdom. What we're talking about here when we talk about the sword of wisdom is the wisdom that cuts through our deception. And we do that with starting off not with thinking, okay, I'm going to have to get into this state of, no delusion. But we actually need to begin to address and investigate our delusional projections. And that's where we need to begin with understanding relative truth. So that's where let's say we have the famous snake that's imputed on the rope. It's not like we'd want to go into saying, okay, I don't want to believe that there is a snake there. There is no snake. The Buddha says there's no snake. That's not going to help us. We're still going to be sitting there thinking, well, that seems to be a very real snake to me. And that's where we need to go, actually, we'll only get free of the angst of snake if we look at that object. And that's where we then finally go, oh my God, it's a rope. And that's where the insight and the liberation doesn't lie in sitting and imagining nirvana or enlightenment or a wiser, reinvented person or self. It comes from actually relating to what is. It comes from investigating that object and seeing it for what it is. So that's where our journey really is all about, our engagement with the phenomenal world. And we have to understand this then is where, while we continually are intending to see what is absolute truth, we need to see absolute truth by means of relative truth, by means of the reality that we have right now. So in doing so, we then can look at the phenomenal world and we can understand it in terms of how it functions. We can also understand the nature of how it is, and we can also see how can we actually validate this way that we understand reality. And so we've looked at the various ways in which we can understand relative truth. We can also understand the nature of relative truth. But now we're looking at the way that we come to this, and that we come to on the basis of two ways of investigation. One is seeing things directly. There's a pot, there's a table, there are chairs. But then also we can, maybe there are things that we can't see. Are the neighbors home? Well, we can maybe hear footsteps upstairs. That's a good indication that they're home. No sound from upstairs. They're not home. So we can of course see the neighbors, but then we also could infer that they're there on the basis of hearing their footsteps, or infer that they're not there on the basis of it being quiet. And this also we of course we apply all the way through the way that we understand the world. Now this is what we call, when there's things that we can see directly, cups and forks, knives, tables, chairs, people, do we see them directly? Yeah, that's what we call direct perception. And this we have looked at over the last few times. Things that we can see physically with our normal five senses, things that we know are also, you can say, we can validate empirically through our consciousness, through just knowing that what we're thinking. Then there's what we call the valid cognition of yogic capacity, the direct perception of yogic knowledge, which is just greater insight, but equally direct, simple seeing by those who have perfected the practice of the path, particularly shamatha and vipassana. And then also we have the direct knowing of the mind, the simple mind in itself, what we refer to as own awareness or natural awareness or reflexive awareness. So these are things that we directly perceive. Now we're looking at these things that we don't directly see. We talk about hidden objects. Again, the neighbors upstairs, or the smoke that indicates there's a fire on the other side of the hill. So that's then where we are presently, and it says here, following direct perception, the second type of valid cognition is inference. This will be explained in three parts: the nature, and then I give the sloka number, its classification, and a response to objections. So the first is how we actually go about knowing things, then the sort of various classification of this category of knowledge, and then also those that might object to such a project altogether. Now, first, as far as the nature of inferential valid cognition can be presented from three perspectives: inference by the mind, inference based on evidence, and the ways in which inference is presented. So we'll have a look at that. The first is very intuitive, and that's really basic to everything that we understand in this world in terms of things that we can't see. So that again comes back to the knowing that whether the neighbors are home or not, or the people upstairs, whether they're home or not. But it also comes down to that immediate thing that we have at a very basic level, where we know that there's something there beyond the appearance, and we just simply know that. For example, if we see somebody smiling, now actually what we're just seeing are some lips that are going up. We look at that person and think, oh, that person's happy. But we actually don't know happiness. We don't know their happiness. It's just a smile, which is a sign of it, you know? Or if we see the garbage bins out, we know, it's garbage, it's bin day, and so forth, you know? Or it's bin day tomorrow. We might not know. We might sort of come back with a jet lag from flying overseas, and then we just don't know what day it is, and then we see the bins. We know, it's, you know, it's Tuesday tomorrow, so forth. Anyway, that's where we look at objects directly. We have direct perception, but we infer something on the basis of seeing them. This is actually something that doesn't take a lot of words. And a lot of what we do with pramana is actually put words to processes that we already validate. But it's pretty good to understand that the Buddhist teaching and understanding of enlightenment, the establishment of emptiness and so forth, is premised on, you could say, valid processes of cognition. So Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche writes, understanding happens through apprehending objects as mental images and mixing those images with names. This is the activity of mental consciousness and its concepts, which then develop all sorts of conventional terminology. So again, like I said, this is really just the very simple fact of us understanding things through indications, and we then begin to understand what's going on, you know? Kenshin Palden Sherab says, as explained above in the overview of valid truth, the definition of inferential valid cognition is the mind that realizes its own hidden object as the object to be proven. And this is done on the basis of a sign that fulfills the three criteria for valid evidence. In brief, the inferential mind is the thinking process with the concepts. Now we're going to look at what these three criteria are. This is what we typically refer to as or translate as a syllogism, tsulsum, but it's a process that exists both in Western logic and also in Buddhist logic. So we'll have a look at that. But it is then where we establish something on the basis of a sign that there's something there, and there's a bin, and while we're not sure of what day in the week it is, that's the hidden object. On the basis of the bin, we then know something. On the basis of somebody's facial expression, we're worried. How did my friend actually, you know, what's my friend feeling like today? You know, he or she might be in a terrible mood. We might have apprehension about meeting somebody, and then we see them come towards us with a big grin on their face. So we actually can't know their mind, but the grin on the face, that's a sign that proves the presence of a hidden object. Anyway, so it says here, in brief, the inferential mind is the thinking process with its concepts. The conceptual nature of inference is the mind's apprehension of a mental image of a specific object, like a vase. So we see a vase, somebody's put out the vase. They might be with the vase sitting on the table. It might be the indication that somebody thinks, darling, it's been a long time since you brought me flowers, or something like that. Then, by having mistakenly identified the appearance with a name, it mixes its object with a word it calls, for instance, vase. Now, this is actually indicating, this is where, and I was a bit confused with this, luckily there's some footnotes, but that actually, what we say mistakenly identifying, is that we actually attribute a solidity to that vase. And that's where it's on a conventional level, yes, it functions as a vase, but it is ultimately a delusional phenomenon in that it doesn't have the inherent existence it appears to have. So that's what we mean there. So that's simply just what we call the world of delusion in which it functions. Things function within this delusional world. And again, it's what we mean with relative truth. The thinking process and its concepts are what understand things. So that's where we look at that phenomenon, the vase, and we begin to think about what that could, what it is. Or in terms of how they function in this world, they develop all sorts of conventional terminology that affirm and negate things. So it's simply on the basis of seeing things and understanding their nature that we operate in this world. We know our way. We go through this world simply by seeing things, understanding what they actually mean. The whole idea of signifier and signified and so forth. Now I'm going to just go over the whole concept of the three criteria and the notion of syllogism. This might be repetition for some, but it's something that operates pretty much in common with the Western definition. So I'm just going to go over this a little bit. Syllogism, as it's understood here. Now, in the Tibetan, we operate with a little bit different approach, which is it's called sulsum, and that's where we talk about phenomena as having, on one hand, you have a reason, or a what is it again? It's the chokche. Yeah, it's simply just the reasoning, and then the way that this reasoning applies in what is called forward pervasion, how this reasoning actually is valid and present, and how in the absence of particular signs, then the reason is not is basically confirmed as not being the case. Anyway, we'll see this now. So just to sort of go back to some of our childhood learning, then the classic Greek syllogism. And I would say if you're not familiar with it, that's totally, me neither. But it is something that's basic to how logic operates within the Western tradition, particularly originating from the Greeks, from Socrates. And that's where this is part of, you could say, the logical tradition that Western philosophy operates with. And you'll see it's really similar then also in the Buddhist context. So the classic Greek syllogism is a three-part logical argument based on deductive reasoning, in which two premises are combined to arrive at a conclusion. So this is what we then call the major and the minor, or the specific premises. As long as the premises of the syllogism are true and the syllogism is correctly structured, the conclusion will be true. It has been reached based on valid signs. So let's say all men are mortal. Okay, that's a fact. This everybody can agree on, and that's where this applies both to ourselves and also to whoever we might be discussing with. We have an insight. Now, we might be wondering whether Socrates, this is Socrates talking about himself, whether he is mortal. Yeah, so the statement is Socrates is mortal. How do we justify or validate that? Well, Socrates is mortal. Well, let's first of all talk about mortality. All men are mortal. All humans are mortal. Socrates is such a human, unlike the immortal gods. Now, in that Socrates is a human, he must be mortal, in that all humans are mortal. So that's where logic establishes a fact. That's where we say, yeah, Socrates is mortal, but we can also establish that as something that is, beyond any kind of doubt. Now, the Buddhist syllogism, it's based on the reason or the sign being present in the subject. So we'll have a look at that. But the validity is further established with what we call forward and reverse indications or pervasions. The validity can be further validated through an example. So that's where we would say we have these, and this is where we continually refer to in the text. We saw here how it talks about the criteria, that there's three criteria. This is done, we can assert something that is hidden on the basis of a sign that fulfills the three criteria for valid evidence. And so we'll look at this. The criterion is the presence of the reason in the subject. The criterion The second criterion is the positive pervasion, and the third criterion is the counter pervasion. What do we mean with criterion? Is the condition that is necessary for proving something. Now here again, going back to old Socrates, we could say the reason being human is present in the subject. So first of all, yeah, the statement is Socrates is mortal because he's a human. So that's where in Buddhist logic you would make a statement. You would make a statement where you argue for a fact. So we argue for the fact that Socrates is mortal because he's human. So that's where we would say the humanity of is present within Socrates, and that's where he then is established as being mortal. We can look at the guy. He's he's one of them. They're mortals. We can see that, and that's why we would say the reason pervades Socrates. The counter pervasion, being divine, is absent in Socrates. For him to be immortal, he would have to be a god. And we look over a bearded old fat Socrates who sits and makes, fills up the bathtub and runs naked through the street, and the eccentric guy that tells the enemy, don't disturb me. This is actually what killed him. I think there was an invasion from some other people, and Socrates was sitting there in the war zone, and his town was occupied, and the enemy came up and sort of threatened Socrates, and he said, please don't disturb me. That off went his head. I believe that was the end of Socrates. But clearly a great thinker, which of course is an understatement, but human, not a god. And so this divinity, that's not happening in Socrates. So we call that the counter indication or the counter pervasion. Everything that substantiates Socrates being mortal, him being human, it's right there in Socrates. He looks damn human. Now this we then take to a Buddhist context, and we would say these kind of things that you very often would see then when it comes to Buddhist logic. We'd say sound is impermanent because it is a product. You probably remember what makes you not a Buddhist, and in general what we call the four seals, the first of which is then phenomena are impermanent because they are composites. And that's where we can say, oh, look, in the nature of phenomena, there is this presence of them phenomena being composite. All composite phenomena are impermanent. So that's where the reason being a product is present in the subject, sound. Now this, by the way, for those of you who read Tibetan, I just put the Tibetan in there, Chokche. So we talk about these three aspects. Chokche, which is the phenomenon or the reason that's present in the subject, the Jekyap, which are then what we call forward pervasion, and the Dokyap, which is the reverse pervasion, the counter pervasion. So the reason, which is being a product, pervades the subject, sound. The counter pervasion, being a permanent phenomena, is entirely absent in sound. The permanent phenomena would mean something like space, or nirvana, or also what we call, non-associated compositional factors like time and so forth. So that's permanent phenomena, but that's absent in sound as such. So then I wanted to give some more domestic examples. So here we have statement of truth using a reasoned argument. Harold must be confused this morning because he's wearing dissimilar socks. So there he has a red sock on one foot and a blue sock on the other. So that's where we have a phenomenon where we can see Harold, who, he's maybe a distracted person. Or else he might be somebody who it may be significant, because maybe we can see the man is out of it. He's simply out of it. So we need to sort of accommodate the fact that Harold, beware, he's he might fly off the handle, or he might not function so well, because we can see, we can imply the hidden condition of Harold's confusion by his confused choice of socks. So that's where wearing these mismatched socks is, in the case of Harold with his conservative taste, a sign of him being confused when he was dressing. So the reason for stating Harold is confused, we say Harold is confused because we look at his choice of socks. So that's the presence of the reason in the subject. The forward pervasion is the reason, the presence of mismatched socks pervades Harold's choice of socks. So that's where we see red and blue socks. The reason is there for this premise that he's confused. The counter pervasion, matching socks, is not happening. This is absence in Harold's choice of hosiery. So this has been established now clearly beyond a speck of doubt that something's awry in the case of Harold. Now, taking that into a more, you could say, universal context, then we would say something that you will often come across. And this is where we talk about emptiness in the Buddhist teaching, that phenomena, they don't possess the reality that we attribute to them. And this is very important. This is coming right down to the core of delusion. And that's where the Buddha then, who's sort of nudging us and saying, hey, don't get deceived. He'll say, and this is a statement of truth using a reasoned argument. He'd say, all phenomena are empty because they're dependently arisen. Praticca samutpada. And this, of course, we have all across the board in the Buddhist teaching. As soon as something is dependently arisen, it doesn't possess the solidity that we attribute to it. And so that's why we would say the presence of the reason is in the subject. Simply in the nature of all phenomena, the reason being dependently arisen is present in the subject, all phenomena. As such then, the forward pervasion, the reason being dependently arisen, that's the reason, that pervades the subject, all phenomena. The counterindication, being a truly existent phenomenon, is not present in any phenomena. And this is important because there's actually nothing that we could say that possesses true existence. So that's where we then have these, and this is then what we call then the presence of the reason in the subject, the forward pervasion, and the counter pervasion. These then are what we call the three criteria for validly asserting a truth, and it applies then particularly when we're looking at something that's a hidden phenomenon. It might not be obvious that phenomena are empty to us, but then we can see, yes, they are conditioned, aren't they? They are dependently arisen phenomena. We can see that. There's nothing solid about them. Otherwise, if we had that counter pervasion of things being a truly existent phenomenon, that would mean that everything would always be exactly the same. Not even as good as Groundhog Day, where at least you have a 24-hour cycle. But, you know, what is it, the Bill Murray movie, right? That he wakes up again and again and again to the same day. And but here it would actually mean that every micro moment would remain the same. Nothing basically would move. But things are moving, and so things are conditioned. They shift, and that is an indication that they are dependently arisen. So this applies when we're looking at understanding emptiness. That's where we can have an intellectual understanding of emptiness that's completely valid. We're not talking about realization of emptiness, but it's just understanding this is phenomena are empty. Harold, we don't really know what Harold is, what he's like, but it's a good indication with his mismatched socks and so forth. So that's where we have these three criteria, and that's where we then generate an understanding. Then Mipham Rinpoche says, mental images appear in the mind, even for beings who do not understand language. By using concepts, they have the ability to mix images with names, to either engage or not engage with objects. And that's where there might not be a vocabulary in the case of animals, what's it called again? The dogs, the Pavlov's dog, right? Knows what's when there's food and so forth. Kids, they might not have understanding, but they see the mother's breast and they go, dinner time, and so forth. So there's images, mental images that happen even when there's no language. So Sherapalden, he says, even for beings who do not understand language, like small children or animals, mental images of things like food and drink appear in their minds. Even though they don't know the names, they have the ability to mix the images with names so that they either accept or reject objects, and they either engage with objects or not. So that's where there is this practice of wanting something or not wanting something on the basis of just an image, and all across the board, even beyond when there's language or not. Without conceptual mind, Mipham Rinpoche writes, there would be no terminology such as negation or affirmation. There would be no inference, no subjects to be learned, and nothing whatsoever could be taught. So this conceptual mind that operates on the basis of these inferences, on the basis of conceptions, that's the foundation for everything that we have in terms of what we would call knowledge. Kenshin Pema Sherab says, without the thinking process and its concepts that mix objects with names, the salt, the pepper, hand me the salt, you get the salt, you don't get the pepper, and so on. There would not be all the conventional terminology of this world, such as negating things and pushing them away, or affirming them and pulling them in. The faulty consequence would be that inference could not deduce hidden phenomena. So no objects could be learned and nothing could be taught about the things in the world. And that's again where we would, if this were to be the case, then we simply wouldn't be able to understand things on the basis of science or even direct. We wouldn't be able to deduce how things are. But we have that. So we are effectively, all right, we are effectively continually operating with valid insight on the basis of science, and also, of course, on the basis of direct perception. But this creates the condition of conceptual knowledge. Through concepts, one can comprehend and affirm things that are not apparent, like goals for the future. Without inference and its concepts, everyone would be like newborn babies. So that's where we could, on the basis of, we don't know the future, but on the basis of having some understanding, concepts that can see, what will go on in the future. We look at the situation of the world at large. We look at our own situation, whether or not there's food in the fridge. Will I be all right tonight? Whether I have my retirement fund in place, whether the situation with the world around us, and so forth. So without these kind of concepts, we would be completely without any ability to navigate the world. Sherapalden then comments, for this reason, it is by using concepts that we have a way to pursue goals for the future and remember the past. And in the present, by applying names and categories to objects, we can comprehend and affirm things that are not apparent, like all the concepts about the conventional world and the concepts based on language. Therefore, without conceptual inference, there would be no activity of accepting what is good and rejecting what is bad, since these are based on evidence. In consequence, the beings of this world would not know what things mean. We would all be like newborn babies. So this is also where, on the basis of us having the ability to reason and to deduce, we can see the value of avoiding negative actions, embracing positive actions, mastering the mind, and in general, engaging in the practice of the path. So even though we don't know enlightenment, even though we don't know necessarily what comes next, on the basis, or we don't know the future. We know that if we presently engage with constructive actions, this will have a positive impact on what comes next. Just like if we know that if we pay our taxes on time, things are a lot easier than if we don't. So all these kind of signs, they're part of the way that we navigate the world successfully. And it's on the basis of not knowing these signs that we have conflict with the world. Inference based on evidence. The second aspect of the nature of inference is based on evidence. So as we saw above, then we're presently in the section where we're looking at the nature of inferential cognition. And then we've just looked at the inference by the mind, which is the overall way that we just intuitively operate with this. Then there's evidence. By relying on a sign, one can understand things. The sign is unmistaken as it fulfills the three criteria for valid evidence. The sign is present in the subject. There is a positive pervasion and a counter pervasion. So this is somewhat, again, what we looked at before, but here we're talking about proof. We're not just talking about a general understanding, but this is where we would say we are proving something. There might be some discussion. Do you think there's anybody over beyond the hill? And then we see smoke come up, and then we can understand, yes, there must be somebody there, because that looks like fire. If there's a fire, then there must be possibly a camp. So somebody is over there beyond the hilltop. So Kenshin Pelton Sherby says, how should the conceptual mind make inferences about phenomena that are hidden? There are two parts to this, which are called inference for one's own sake and inference for the sake of others. Inference for oneself has the same meaning as inferential valid cognition. So that again, yeah. So first of all, the essence of inferential valid cognition or inference for oneself is a mind that realizes the object to be proven based on a sign that fulfills the three criteria for valid evidence. So that's where we say that there's a fire because there's smoke, but it's also there that we, for example, looked at something which is quite significant. We looked at the fact that all phenomena are empty because they're dependently arisen. Now, if we were to say that the counter pervasion, the counter indication, being a truly existent phenomena, is not present in any phenomena. Now that's where, if we're talking with somebody else, then they would necessarily have to be clued in on what we mean with the lack of inherent existence. And that's where you can see, if you listen to teachings on Madhyamika, if the presenter is sitting up there saying, well, phenomena must necessarily be empty because they're dependently arisen, unless you know what is meant with dependently arisen, you would actually not have a clue what on earth they're saying when they say phenomena are empty. And that's where this is so important then, when you're having a discussion, that there's a shared premise, that there's a shared understanding. Of course, for someone who is clued in, who doesn't know what the implication of dependent arising is, yes, then it's logical that phenomena are necessarily empty. And likewise also, if somebody has no idea what, they might just think, well, you know, that guy, he mismatching socks. They might just think, what a brilliant person. He's clearly an artiste. He's clearly an eccentric, you know, he's free of conventional boundaries. But for the rest of us who are a little bit clued in, then yes, well, in the case of Harold, it's just that he's rather distracted and confused. So that's where there's a difference whether we are discussing, and we could say we arrive at an understanding based on our own sort of what we would say valid reasons, and of course those that we establish in conversation or in debate with others. So then again, the Pramanavartika states, the discourse on valid cognition states, of these two types of inference for oneself sees sees its object through a sign with three criteria. So that's evidence. Now, the relationship between the sign and the property to be known. So that's why we say an inference about a hidden phenomena is proven through its relationship with a sound, with a sign that is established by valid direct perception. So the Kenshin says, to return to the main point, a sign or reason is established by experiencing whichever of the four types of valid perception is suitable. So of course, in the case of looking at Harold, that's through the direct perception on the basis of what can be seen. But then again, we could also have something where we're thinking of something and we're thinking, you know, on the Friday we're going to have a going away party for so and so. I'll need to do some shopping or whatever. That's in the mind. And then again, there's also possibly direct perception by yogic insight, which is actually reading possibly this. You could say, we would say yogis have this ability to read the phenomenal world and read in terms of what will happen, reading auspicious signs or inauspicious signs and so forth. And then also we have the simply just the direct experience of the mind, the own awareness. But anyway, it's on the basis of these that we then understand something, and we would say by relying on the sign, one makes an inference about some hidden phenomena, which is the object to be comprehended. To establish an inference, there must be a relationship between the sign and that which is to be inferred. Without that relationship, the inference cannot be proven. So that's why we see smoke on the hill, and that has to necessarily be a smoke that's related to fire. If we just see steam coming up, that doesn't indicate fire at all. So there has to be a relationship between the object. Somebody points to the hill and to some steam that's coming up. There's some hot springs, and they say, "Oh, there's fire over there," and you go, There's no relationship between steam and fire. That's not there. So again, the ascertaining of valid cognition states, without that, a relationship won't happen. A reason based on anything other than a relationship is merely a false reason. And that's where we say our friend who points to the steam coming up and tells us that there's fire, we know that that person actually has the wrong end of the stick. There's not really proper insight taking place there. All right. So let's just see if there's some questions. Let's see. So we can only dismantle the delusion of self by developing an awareness that is entirely dependent on a sense of self. Yes, because we need to be aware of how we need to have that humble recognition that we are very much caught up in a self. I'm often quoting, well, actually Jeffrey Hopkins, who would say how in the Gelug tradition, when they talk about no self, the first thing the teacher does is actually make one of the students sort of feel upset. Of course, this is in a classroom situation of pretty robust individuals. So there's not a danger that the student is going to sue the teacher for having been abusive, but more just that the teacher wants actually to bring out a sense of self. So the teacher will go in and say, "You there, I know you stole, you've been taking money from my wallet, haven't you? I'm missing 100 rupees and you're the one I think you've taken it." And immediately the student will go, "Me? No, I'm innocent." And that's where then the teacher will then say, "Hey, we're talking about a self. Can you identify that self now?" And yes, there's that sense of indignance, me. And that's where the cause of suffering lies, that sense of me. You know, if let's say the student hasn't taken the $100 or 100 rupees, student just say, nope, I haven't done it, and be completely at ease, all right? But that's sort of coming out, me. That's where we can begin to see that it's a reality. It's a, you know, very vivid reality. But that's where there's a difference. You could say, well, that's normal. Yeah, but that's normal, but also that's also the normal cause of suffering. So that's what we're onto here. Is Buddha's nature a truly existent phenomena once it is present in all beings? Oh, that's such a big discussion. But we would say even Buddha nature, it wouldn't function if it was a truly existent phenomena. We would say there's no phenomena that withstands analysis. There's no phenomena that we would say has inherent existence. But then again, in that Buddha nature is something that is untainted by confusion, and in that the realization of Buddha nature is the complete elimination of confusion altogether. Then sometimes we have something very provocative, and I hope I'm not going to confuse anybody, but we actually do, if you look in the Uttara Tantra Shastra, we do refer to it as the great self. We refer to it as permanent, and we refer to it as ultimately valid. So that's where it's so important. That's also why in the teachings, they first teach Madhyamaka before they teach Buddha nature. Otherwise, the implication is that you really need to understand how phenomena lacks inherent existence, and it is the realization of this lack of inherent nature that prompts the freeing of Buddha nature. We could say the entire delusion that applies across the board is that we solidify things, we objectify things, we try to hold on to things as a reference point. And so the last thing we want to do is turn Buddha nature into such a phenomenon. So, but nevertheless, in that it is ultimately valid, we do have some traditions that would say Buddha nature is real. It's empty. Yeah, but it's just empty of everything that's delusion. And these traditions we call other empty. Then there's the presentation of Buddha nature it says that all phenomena by nature are empty, including Buddha nature itself. But that is that realization is what that allows for awakening, and that this tradition we would call then the self-empty or the intrinsic emptiness traditions. So as you can hear, it's complex. There's some interesting discussions that take place around this. So why train to abandon conceptual mind? Would it not be preferable to just train it to not get trapped in the suffering kinds of destructive concepts? Same thing, yeah. That's okay. The Buddha obviously would be able to relate to the world on the basis of using the same words. The Dalai Lama, we could say, is not trapped in the conceptual mind, but he's still able to say, please bring me a glass of water, you know, or saying, this is my book, this is my friend Desmond Tutu, and so forth. So the Dalai Lama is not trapped in any kind of destructive concepts. He operates with a conceptual mind, but yet there's a big difference between the way that we can be trapped and, like you say yourself, not trapped, or being free. So yes, but what we're on about here in our practice of Vipassana is to arrive at that place where we're not trapped by duality, by the delusion, and so forth. So that we would say the Buddha has two wisdoms, the wisdom that knows things as they are, and also as they appear to sentient beings. Okay. I think I'll wait with the next section here, even though it looks like there's no more questions, but I think I will wait to the next section because it And that will actually be, I'm going to be gone for a while, by the way. This is our last class. Let's just see here. No, actually, I can do something next Wednesday. Yeah, let's meet again next Wednesday. I'm still in the country. I'm going to be going away from the end of June until the end of August, as I think some of you know. But and I'll be on the road next Wednesday. But I think I can do. I think it'll be okay. I'm happy to do that. Yeah, that should be fine. So we'll do class next Wednesday, and then we'll go over this, and which is actually quite good because it'll take us to it might even be a short class. I think it might be a short class. But anyway, then we'll, and I'm stopping after that because then we'll go into a section which actually, which is, well, maybe we'll begin it anyway, but we'll go into what we call the classifications of valid cognition. And there's two that has to do with conventional reality, knowing conventional reality, and then also absolute truth. So maybe we'll begin that next time. But anyway, we'll leave it at that here today. There'll be one more class next Wednesday, and then there'll be a school break. You won't have to contend with all these argumentations and so forth. But I do hope that it's clear that this does serve a purpose in terms of us respecting and understanding that we're not just sort of holding on to ideas because they sound great or because they, because the Buddha said so, but we are encouraged to actually understand things on the basis of what we can validate through direct insight, and also, like we're looking at here, through inference. I would say as homework, please go over this and try to, you could say, establish an overview. What we're talking about here is the two truths, how things appear to us in each our relative, from each our relative perspective, and how things intrinsically, the nature of reality is free from our particular way of perceiving things. And that's where we want this vipassana, this wisdom, this wider perspective. And that is what will free us from suffering. So that's where we want to understand the value of understanding the relative and absolute truth and be able to navigate that. And that's where we do this on the basis of these various kinds of reasonings that apply to relative truth. And in terms of establishing the validity of that reasoning, we're then looking at both what we can call the direct perceivers and also the inferential understanding that we looked at today. So to get a little bit the overview and begin to see how it applies in our ordinary life, like Harold and his mismatched socks and other, if you can make up your own sort of similar sort of observations, see how we know things on the basis of that it's there, but we also do tend to know things on the basis of ideas that we have in our mind. Somebody tells us a story about what their vacation was like, and they say, oh, and then we didn't get the room that we had ordered. Can you imagine how painful that was? And as we're sitting there, we have an image in our mind about the situation, about not getting the room they were, and we can sort of express with deep empathy, oh my God, that's terrible, And then they served my coffee with, it was spilt in the sauce and all that. The thing is, we can basically empathize and understand things through mental, and we can also, we can see how there's a big difference in individuals when there's a strong presence of affliction and when there's a lack of affliction. That's where we can talk about what we call yogic direct perceivers, but because we can see that we can be more or less aligned with reality. That's basically what we mean with yoga. And so when we're really not aligned with reality, basically when people are out of it, we can see how they cannot judge properly. And we can see how a peace of mind, sanity, you could say, constitutes yogic direct perceivers. Of course, here we were talking about yogic direct perceivers in the nth degree, you know, being able to see the sort of the subtle nature of reality and so on. But we can validate these kind of things on the basis of our own reflections and the observations in our own life. And we can see when we sit down and meditate, we can see, I'm not following after thoughts, and yet there is a cognition. That's what we then refer to as the reflexive awareness, or the natural awareness. So these are all things that the topics that we've been discussing here, they are things that we're continually operating with within our experience. All right. Thank you very much for participating in this class. Makes me very happy that there are people who are interested in this. And I think the Buddhas of the 10 directions, they are rejoicing in your commitment to this. So let's dedicate. Thank you. 谢谢. See here. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.